afternoon and a warm welcome to this first in the series of Come and Be Revived. It's a series of 6 talks on social justice and is a joint partnership between the readers of Chester Diocese and Chester Cathedral. And to start the series, the Venerable Michael Gilbertson, the Archdeacon of Chester, is going to speak on speaking out for justice, how the Church in Melanesia is making a difference. Chester Diocese has a link with the Solomon Islands, and Mike has visited there, as well as working with the Melanesian Mission UK to support their mission. Before we begin, I'm going to say a prayer, but I want to show you this. If it comes up, I hope it does. This is a gift that was given to the cathedral by the brothers in the Solomon Islands. It's a canoe, and it's made of beautiful wood and engraved with various shells. And the reason I want to show it to you is the prayer I'm going to say is called the Islanders' Prayer. There are over 800 islands, 900 islands, I believe, and this prayer is called the Islanders' Prayer. So a prayer before we begin. O Jesus, be the canoe that upholds me in the sea of life. Be the steering that guides me. Be the outrigger that supports me in times of great temptation. Let your spirit be my sail, which carries me all the way to you. Keep my body strong, so that I can paddle on with strength and safety and reach my home. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Well, it's very good to see everybody this afternoon. And it's a great privilege to be part of this series looking at some difficult and challenging issues from across the world and from many different angles. We love and serve a God of love and grace and hope who wants to transform our world to bring peace and justice. And so we're thinking over these next few weeks about how can we as Christians really make a difference. There's a verse which might focus our thoughts at the very beginning of our time together, from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17. Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. A real sense there of our loving Father God and his concern for everyone, and his concern that there should be justice in our world. As Jane's already said, we're beginning this series right over the other side of the world in Melanesia, in the Southwest Pacific. I'm hoping that Father Nelson Bacco might be joining us. Nelson's got great connections with Chester. When I arrived in the diocese, he was studying for a degree at Chester University, and he's been back since. He's also since then spent part of his time being head brother of the Melanesian Brotherhood. So he holds very influential and responsible position in the church in the Solomon Islands in Melanesia. And so I hope he can join us, but you need to bear with him because there is about 10 hours time difference. So that's why it might be difficult for him. It's, I think, about 11:15 at night at the moment in Honiara. But we do have with us Katie Drew, who introduced herself earlier, who indeed, she's not expecting this, but she might want to add something at the end of what I've said. Katie is from the Melanesian Mission UK, which is the British society which fosters links between the church here and the church in Melanesia, and there's a lot of interchange between our two churches. As Jane said, there's a long-standing link between the Diocese of Chester and the Anglican Church of Melanesia, the province in Melanesia, which goes back over 30 years. I've been fortunate enough to visit there and to get to know many people from the Melanesian Church over the last few years. And if you're wondering what I'm wearing a wonderful, a magnificent shirt that was made for me by the Mothers Union in Honiara. They had an enormous, they must have had an enormous consignment of material that was all the same pattern. And a lot of them were wearing a uniform like that at the time. And so they made me a shirt like that, if you just in case you're wondering what that is, but it gets us into the mood a bit. Where is Melanesia? For some of you who may not know, this is, as you can see, is a map of the Southwest Pacific. And in that blue shape, just to the north east of Australia, is the geographical entity of Melanesia, which is bigger than the area that we're talking about. But you can see that that large area, large island of New Guinea, north of Australia, and then east of that, you might be able to make out the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and New Caledonia. And that's the geographical area of Melanesia, that blue shape. But the Anglican province of Melanesia, 9 dioceses of the Anglican Church, cover 3 territories: the 2 sovereign nations of the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and then New Caledonia, which is an overseas territory of France. So those 3, I don't know whether you can see my cursor on the screen, but those 3 countries, those territories in the middle of that block. Melanesia is overwhelmingly the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and New Caledonia. So the area covered by the Anglican province of Melanesia is overwhelmingly Christian, and the church plays a very influential role in society there. Not just the Anglican Church, although in many areas it's primarily the Anglican Church, but also the Roman Catholic Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and so on. Also, it's very active across different generations. So you'll find a lot of younger people, younger generations still very much involved in the life of the church. And one phenomenon which is very marked across that whole region is the role of the religious orders. There are 4 active in Melanesia: the Melanesian Brothers, the Sisters of Melanesia, the Sisters of the Church, and the Franciscans. And through contact with those, I've learned so much about Christian discipleship and Christian faith, and the sense of joy and the relationship between worship and everyday life, and something of discipleship and sacrifice from contacts in those 4 religious orders. And I'm sure that Jane and George, who's also been out to the Solomon Islands, and Katie, who's been all around that area, would say the same thing. And if Nelson joins us later, I hope he'll be able to say a few words about that. But as elsewhere in the world, even though the church has a very influential role in the society in the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and so on, there are still large issues and challenging issues raised by social injustice, real challenges in that society. And although it's a very different context, right on the other side of the world, there is lots that we can learn from that context and from what our brothers and sisters are doing to try to bring God's justice to bear in that situation. And so what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is simply to give a few examples of what's happening there. And as I say at the end, Katie may want to add things from her perspective. But before we go right over to the other side of the world, I'm going to go to Chester Cathedral from last week. Last week, Jane and I and several others were there to receive an icon that had been painted especially for Chester Cathedral, and which was set up in the Martyrs Chapel in the South Transept. It's still there, I hope, and you can go and see it in the cathedral. The picture you can see is of 7 members of the Melanesian Brotherhood who were martyred in 2003. And the reason that I start with that is partly because of the Chester connection, but partly because it brings us right to the heart of the church's role in Melanesia in working for justice. around the turn of the century, there were 5 very painful years of ethnic tension in the Solomon Islands, inter-ethnic tension with a lot of violence, and which really left a scar on the whole country. Some very powerful warlords were really running wild in ways which eventually meant that there had to be international intervention. A United Nations force led by Australia had to go in and restore peace. But during that period, the Melanesian brothers were extremely active in trying to bring about peace. They oversaw at the end of the conflict, they oversaw the destruction of some of the weapons that had been held by people. And there was one particular warlord, somebody called Harold Keke, in the island of Guadalcanal, who refused to take part in the peace-building process. One of the brothers, called Nathaniel Sado, went to try to plead with him to take part and to get him and his followers to lay down their arms. He refused. 6 other brothers went, knowing the dangers, to help Nathaniel, and in the end they were all killed in extremely brutal ways. They are remembered as martyrs by the Anglican Communion, and their day is the 24th of April each year. And so it's fitting, because of this link, that we have them at the heart of what's going on in Chester Cathedral today, as a reminder of the sacrifice that they made, and as an inspiration for us to follow. And I suppose their legacy is that today, although it's still a very poor place, the Solomon Islands is a very peaceful place, very low levels of serious violent crime. And the way in which the Brotherhood is still very respected today, I think owes something of what people know of the sacrifice that those 7 men made. And you can go to Tabalia today, the headquarters of the Melanesian Brotherhood, and see the graves of those 7 martyrs. The current and the previous Archbishop of Canterbury have both been there and led services and preached and so on. So that really sets the scene, showing how deeply committed the Church in Melanesia is to really making a difference and seeking to bring God's justice. So I want to move on to talk in a bit more detail about 2 particular issues. One is climate change. I'm just checking that you can all still hear me. Can you wave your hands if you still hear me? Good, because I have to keep checking on Zoom that people can do that. This is a quotation from the former Archbishop of Melanesia, George Takeli. As a region with a relatively low carbon footprint, we seem to be paying a heavy price for the rest of the world's overdevelopment and wastefulness. I think if you asked a lot of people in Melanesia what is the key issue facing them, they would say climate change. Picking up on what George is saying there, the Pacific region of the world contributes something like 0.03% of global carbon emissions. Although the population of the Pacific makes up 0.12% of the world's population. If you do your maths very quickly, you'll see that what that means is that per head, the emissions that are being generated in that region are, sorry, there's some other sound coming from somewhere. Per head, the emissions which are coming from that region are only 1/4 of the average in the world. And of course, in the very developed world, there can be much, the discrepancies can be much greater. So what's happening is that those relatively poor societies are producing very little in the way of greenhouse gases, but they are really at the sharp end in suffering the results of what the rest of us are doing. The climate crisis is having a devastating impact on that region. So this is an issue of not only of climate, environment, it's actually an issue of justice, with the problem caused overwhelmingly by the developed world, but with the poorest communities most immediately affected. For us in Britain, it still seems quite in some ways, an indirect problem. It's not something which affects us day by day in quite the same way, but it does for them. And here are a few examples of what's happening. One key issue for those communities is coastal erosion and the loss of communities as sea levels rise. This is the island of Walande in a picture taken in 2002. So about 18 years ago, Walande was an artificial island built over many centuries, with a thriving community there, and that's what it looked like 18 years ago. That's what it looked like in 2019. You can see that with rising sea levels, it's just disappeared. It's had to be abandoned, with all of the dislocation and trauma that involves, and the difficulty, especially in a society like that, of groups of people who've been living there for a very, very long time, having to make their way and find homes elsewhere, which is not always easy. Another issue for that area is that it's heavily dependent on root crops that I guess might be familiar to you, things like cassava, yam, taro, and that makes up a very heavy, a very important part of the diet there. As the soil becomes salinated and the sea level rises and salt leaches into the soil, so those crops rot. So it becomes much more difficult to use them as food. And not just crops that are in the ground, bananas, coconuts, so on, all affected by that change. And changing weather patterns as well. I mean, we might see changing weather patterns here. We might see a bit more serious storms in different parts of the year. We might see flooding and so on. Not as serious as they're seeing there, where the whole rhythm of wet and dry seasons on which their agriculture is based has been disrupted. And more frequent and more serious tropical cyclones. There seems to be one along every few months. This year it was Cyclone Harold, and from this diocese we sent money to the church in Melanesia to help in recovery from the damage that had been done by that. So that's some of the issues caused by climate change. What is the church locally doing to help to tackle that? And here are two examples of what the church locally is doing. First of all, the church in Melanesia is training up somebody in each parish to do really important nuts and bolts things. They've been trained to take weather measurements and to record changes in the local environment. And they've been called green apostles. Here are some of them at work doing very practical measurement of what is happening to weather patterns and sea level. The data that they're producing is collected by the church in Melanesia, the headquarters of the provincial church. It's shared with government and with international agencies, and it's used also to help the church in supporting vulnerable communities who are facing food and water shortages. And it feeds into the efforts to relocate buildings or sometimes whole communities and to prepare for disasters. It's a really vital part of what the church can do, really to make a difference in tackling what is a huge and very pressing issue nationally and locally. So Green Apostles, also the University of Southampton is working with the Melanesian Mission UK. We're helping to support the work that they're doing in mapping sea level changes across the Solomon Islands and using that to lobby the national government and international bodies to raise awareness of the issues and to help communities who are or who will be affected by that in the future. So bringing hard data to bear on this issue. And that is a project which was identified by the church in Melanesia as really important, and that's why we're helping to fund it. So you can see that the church, both in Melanesia and here, is working to help to make a real difference in gathering information that can be used nationally and internationally to combat this problem. I've already given several plugs to the Melanesian Mission UK. Jane and I are heavily involved in that, and Katie, the executive officer, is with us on this Zoom today. If you're at all interested, you can join in with what's going on locally in the diocese. In our link with Melanesia, there's information on the website, but please also get in touch with Jane or me. But nationally, we're plugged into the Melanesian Mission UK, and they have a very helpful website, lots of videos and information about things like climate change and the different projects which are going on. So there's the web address. Do make use of that. And as I'm sure Katie might want to plug, the annual meeting, the annual general meeting of MMUK is next Monday evening, and it's not too late to sign up if you want to join it. It's all on Zoom this year, so there's no excuse. So that's just something about what the church is doing about climate change. The second area that I wanted to look at was about family life in the Solomon Islands. There's a long-standing problem of domestic violence in that society, as there is in many parts of the world, but they have a particular issue there. And the church has been very active in working to counter it and to try to end it. The Christian Care Centre is something which has been set up in Honiara, and it now has a branch also on a neighbouring island called Malaita. It's run by the Sisters of the Church, the Sisters of Melanesia, and the Mothers Union on behalf of the Anglican Church. It provides a safe haven for women and their children who are victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse. And it emphasises that all women and children have a right to a life free from violence. It's the only centre of its kind in the Solomon Islands, and it takes in women from all over the country and from all different religious backgrounds. It was opened in 2004, so around the time that those 7 brothers lost their lives, because it was in response to a trend of escalating violence that was happening during that ethnic tension. It brought domestic violence as well as intercommunal violence. So wives, women and girls who are being subject to rape and sexual assault as a result of ethnic tension on Guadalcanal Island. And this centre, originally set up in that context, has continued since. It's now been running for 16 years. It provides counselling, medical care, legal support, a safe space. It provides life skills and practical skills to empower people to go back to their communities in safety. The staff from the centre assess the context that people are going back into to make sure it's safe and so on. Alongside that, the church is running a male advocacy programme to address issues of violence and abuse, where to try to get men to understand more deeply issues of gender and expectations of for men to be good husbands, fathers, brothers, uncles, grandfathers, and so on. And the 2 male religious orders, the Society of St. Francis and the Melanesian Brotherhood, are heavily involved in that programme at the Christian Care Centre, and also they deliver it as they go out and visit the villages as part of their ongoing missions. Alongside that also, there is something called the Positive Parenting Programme, run by the Mothers Union, the people who provided this shirt for me. And that sends representatives out to communities to train up local leaders, to run courses, to support groups in their own parishes and in rural villages. It's a sort of training the trainers thing, helping participants to lead groups, really helping to focus on how parenting can be more successful, more informed, considering current issues that affect families, cultural traditions, and how that relates to modern life and so on. It covers child development, health, hygiene, nutrition. It talks about cycles of abuse and deprivation, and the role of parents and mothers and fathers, and what is really vital in the Melanesian context, the wider family as well, parents, grandparents, and so on. So that's, again, is making a real practical difference. So we've looked at the two things, climate change and family life, two areas where the church is really making a contribution on the ground. And just briefly, a third area, which sort of broadened things out, which is to do with the whole area of human rights. The Melanesian Church asked for the Melanesian Mission UK 2 or 3 years ago now to help to introduce human rights into the curriculum in church schools, because it's not covered by the government's national curriculum. So people have been out to do that and to train up local teachers in delivering it. So teachers in each church secondary school there have been delivering a series of lessons to increase the understanding of human rights and how that integrates with Christian beliefs and values, and helping schools to inhabit those more successfully as well. And that's been funded partly by the British High Commission in the Solomon Islands, and it's also now spreading. It's being introduced into Papua New Guinea as well. So that's really lifting our eyes from the very local to sort of international concern about respect for human rights, and the church being involved in that as well. As part of the work that's been done on that, that verse has been central to that work. The verse I started with, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. So I started with that verse and I finished with that verse. And on the way through, we've had a look at something of what our brothers and sisters across the other side of the world have been doing in these really practical areas of climate justice and family life and domestic abuse and so on. I find what they're doing inspirational in a very tough context, much that we can learn from that. And I hope that just introducing that to you has been helpful for you in thinking, what does it mean for the church to make a difference, not just here in Britain, but across the world? I think that's all that I wanted to say. I think that I'm going to hand it back to Jane, because I think the floor is open for questions and discussion. But Jane, I wonder, it may be that Katie, from the national perspective, may want to say a few words as well at this point.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for that informative talk. Katie, I can't see you, but wherever you are, can you see me, Katie?
Yes, I can.
Oh, there you are. Brilliant. Katie, do you want to say something, add something to what Mike has said? It'd be really helpful if you could.
I think, thank you, Mike, for your presentation. And it's really important to bring up those three areas. With the mission work that the church does in Melanesia, it's a holistic mission. It's very much listening to the needs of that community day by day and week by week. And I always say that the week starts in Melanesia on a Sunday when the notices go on for hours. So don't ever complain about your church notices. That's when people find out the needs within their local community. And it might be that a house has been destroyed or a family is sick. And then after those notices, the church then discuss how to best help in that area. So it's all about holistic mission. And in the three areas that Mike mentioned about, you know, that's what was preying on the minds of the church. It was climate change, it's family life, and it's human rights. And the church works together with the religious orders and the Mothers Union to deliver a holistic programme to not only to the Anglicans, but to all of the three nations there.
Thank you, Katie. That's very helpful. Has anybody got a question they'd like to ask? If you can wave or even attract my attention somehow. So Nigel has just put, it seems to me that we in the UK need to do so much more to tackle climate change. Where is Nigel? Because perhaps starting with teaching within the church. So Nigel has put a comment on the chat line saying perhaps we should start more with teaching in the church about climate change, focusing on that one area. I agree absolutely, Nigel. I'm sure you're right. Has anyone else got a comment or a question? Do use the chat line if you're comfortable with that, or raise your hand for a comment or a question.
As a quick response to Nigel, you might have noticed that the Church of England quite daringly has committed to go carbon neutral by 2030, which is an extremely ambitious timescale. And that was decided in February this year at General Synod, and we're still working out exactly how we approach that. But the Church is looking to take a lead on this.
Thank you, Mike. Jane, you'll have to unmute yourself first.
You mentioned about the schools and the work that's being done there, and mentioned specifically church schools. Is there something similar going on? Do they have state schools, or are they all church schools? And what's the difference in terms of the approach to the green issues that you mentioned?
I might let Katie come in on some of that. Certainly, there are a lot of state schools, and I think church schools make up the minority, but there are plenty of them, and they have a relationship with the local church and with the diocese. In some ways, similar to how they are in this country, but I think the difference would be that while hopefully all schools in the Solomon Islands will be aware of the issues of climate change, it's all around them. What's going on in church schools is that how it's thought about is expressed in more clearly in a Christian context. And so the teachers, the chaplains at those schools will be trying to set it in our understanding of God and the world. And actually that, one thing that we haven't mentioned is one of the programs that we've been involved with from this country, helping church schools in Melanesia is developing a greater sense of Christian distinctiveness in their curriculum. And we could have talked about that today, but we haven't. So that's helping to deliver that. It's also the case, I think, Katie will correct me if I'm wrong, that although the state took over some church schools a while ago and is now trying to give them back, I think partly because they see that the church has a more coherent way of running them, I think. But Katie, you might want to comment on. I should say Katie has been over to the Solomon Islands on several occasions, and so knows much more about what's going on the ground. Katie.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, a bit similar to this country in that a lot of people in the Solomon Islands would rather send their children to a church school rather than a state school. So they clearly see a difference in the teaching and the atmosphere within the schools. But as Mike said, when the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu became independent, a lot of the schools were handed to the government. And there is discussion now for 30 schools in Vanuatu to be handed back to the church for them to run and manage. And one of the other things that we do is we do link the church schools in these countries with schools in the UK, including churches in Chester Diocese. And there's been programs where children have exchanged ideas and drawings about the environment. So it's certainly being discussed and taught in those church schools.
Is there anything between church schools in Melanesia and schools in the Chester Diocese? You mentioned links with churches, but
yes,
are there any between church schools?
Direct school-to-school links, Jane, yes. We have, from memory, I think about well, certainly half a dozen schools, church primary schools in the diocese who have existing links with primary schools in Melanesia, and one secondary school. I'm a governor at Woodchurch High School that has an active link with St Nicholas School in Honiara, and we're trying to expand. We actually have a waiting list of schools in this diocese who are keen to develop those partnerships, and it's sometimes a matter of finding schools in Melanesia who are ready to take that on. We've had staff from schools in Melanesia over here on visits. It would be great if we could have reciprocal visits in the other direction, but it's proving quite difficult to organise. And of course, just at the moment, any travel to the Solomon Islands or Vanuatu is impossible at the moment because of COVID-19.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before we could finish? I can't see. George.
Under the tag of human rights, Mike, I just wonder whether you have any opinions about how the church in Melanesia, particularly in the Solomon Islands, might react to the government policy decision to abandon economic support from Taiwan and move towards economic support from China. It seems to me this raises all kinds of acute economic and political tensions, at least the possibility of those.
Yes, I mean, to be fair, George, I've not personally had conversations with people in Melanesia about that. Katie might have done more recently. Certainly, up until the present, the visibility of inward investment, well, very obviously from Australia and New Zealand, but also from Taiwan, was very evident. And that shift in government policy is I guess it will raise big issues. I mean, the role of China in that part of the world is one which raises a lot of concerns for people. You see what happens in Hong Kong, and whether there is concern being raised within the local church, local communities. To be honest, I just don't know whether people are thinking about it on that sort of level. Katie might have more information on that from her more regular contacts with the church.
From what I've read and gathered, the decision to switch allegiance from Taiwan to China was purely financially driven, in that the Chinese were offering more money for certain developments that the government wanted funding. But it's caused absolute outrage within the country to the extent where the province of Malaita, which was involved with the civil war, wants to do a vote of independence and actually leave the Solomon Islands. And there's talk of an island being acquired by the Chinese government for a new port within the region. So these are quite dangerous times, I feel, for the people. And I don't think any thought has been given to the human rights issues which are happening in China itself. But that's just what I've picked up. That's not a comment from the church out there. That's my own observations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
George, I know you visited the Solomons last year, didn't you? Was this something that was being discussed then?
No, I was just very struck during my visit how many Taiwanese flags I saw all around the place. So that it seemed that Taiwanese support for the economy was much appreciated in many respects. And this switch, largely for financial reasons initially, I think something that raises an enormous issues for the middle and long-term future, and the role of the church within the Solomons in maybe speaking out about what might be taking place.
Thank you. I think we'll finish. Nigel has a question, so we'll finish with Nigel's question. Where are you, Nigel?
He's put something on chat about cancel the debt campaign.
I just had a
Yes,
message.
I have.
Oh, Nigel.
Hello, Nigel.
Hello, hello. I don't know how burden of debt actually affects the Melanesian Islands per se, but I know that I know because I've been signed something and did a Facebook, Twitter post, cancel the debt today. That Oxfam are pushing for this because, of course, and it ties in nicely in a way with the Chinese question, because in a sense, by inward investment, we make these nations in a sense dependent upon either Western or Chinese governments, and often a burden of debt is created that they cannot possibly repay. And I think there's great issues of justice there that need to be explored fully and tackled. And it's an observation, perhaps more than a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will wrap up there. Thank you much for coming. I forgot to say at the beginning, we did have King's School coming in. So we had some sixth formers here, but they had to go to their lessons, of some of you would have seen from chat. So they went off to their lesson at 1:45. Thank you very much, Mike, very, very much indeed, and to Katie as well for being here. Next week, we're going to think about the issue Black Lives Matter, and the new bishop, the Right Reverend Mark Tanner, is going to talk with someone he knows very well, the Reverend Dr Calvin Samuel. They're going to talk together about Black Lives Matter. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much for coming, and have a good week.